If everybody could take their seats, we're about to resume. And we'll begin with the parties questioning the fourth panel, and we'll begin with the City of San Bruno.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is directed to PHMSA, whoever is best situated to answer. Yesterday, a member of the PG&E witness panel acknowledged that, in essence, age does matter when it comes to pipelines. How do you determine if a pipeline operator adequately addressed in its integrity management program characteristics that may be associated with age of a pipeline? And obviously, we have a particular interest in the situation that occurred in San Bruno, where the age of the pipeline suggested that perhaps the records were not correct and/or that the inspections programs did not adequately identify the situation.
You know, when an operator looks at its records, it has the responsibility of assuring that those records are as good as they can be. When it is conducting its integrity management plan assessment, it has the responsibility of assuring that it has the best information possible. And when it makes its decisions on the threats to assess, it must base that on the best information available and put in safety precautions. The whole part of integrity management, the whole philosophy, is to identify the risks and the threats and to assess for them. And then once you know what you're dealing with, you address those. You must have good information, and your plan must be based on the best information, the best integration of data that you can get, and you apply good safety factors into that. When you assess your pipeline and you find issues, you must repair them. Then you must apply that to the rest of your line. So, and it's about learning, taking the information you learn and putting it back into your plan. You apply mitigative and preventive measures. But one of the big issues that we are looking at right now is whether operators are doing a good job on risk assessment, whether they understand what they have. You asked specifically about age. There are some things we know about age. We do know that pipeline age is not necessarily the only factor to look at. You may have an older pipeline that is in very good shape. But on the other hand, if there are unknowns, if there is, there's a type of pipe called a pre-70 low-frequency ERW pipe that we know can be problematical. If you have that type of pipe, then we would expect you to do some really hard thinking about how you're going to assess that pipe. So you do have to factor that into your integrity management.
I'm assuming by your answer that PHMSA does look then in terms of the audit or the overview, or rather the CPUC should be looking for indication in the integrity management program that those issues are adequately addressed.
Yes. Every operator is expected to thoroughly understand their system. Every pipeline system is unique. One of the benefits of the integrity management program is that it is not a cookie-cutter regulation. It does not have a one-size-fits-all answer to integrity issues. It says you must know your pipe and you must assess for the threats to that pipe, whether they be very unique or not, and then you must address them.
Thank you. Again, for the PHMSA panel member best able to answer the question, there was discussion yesterday regarding control room operational procedures and other factors associated with controls and maintenance that may have had an impact or an effect with regard to this accident. How do you determine if the operator's operational procedures and procedural factors are adequately addressed within an operator's integrity management program?
Could you please restate that? I think I got lost.
How do you determine if operational procedures such as control room operations and/or maintenance procedures are adequately addressed within an operator's integrity management program?
Okay, would you like to?
We have a control room management regulation that's coming out that's specifically designed to look at control room issues. The integrity management program really looks towards threats to a pipeline. If there was problems with the control equipment or something like that, that could come under equipment threat under the integrity management plan. If there was trending where there had been issues for that type of thing. So that's where we would look at it.
Thank you. This question is for the PUC. Considering the population density in the area, the intensity of the fire, and the length of time that it took to isolate the ruptured section, will the PUC be considering the requirement or encouragement of automatic shutoff valves, remote control valves, and/or improved pressure monitoring systems in the pipeline?
The answer is yes. We've already begun that. The commission ordered out a rulemaking on February 24th. It has two phases to it, a phase A and a phase B. And in phase A, we talk about rules for construction, especially with respect to remotely controlled valves and automatic shutoff valves.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
PG&E,
We have no questions.
IBEW,
We have no questions.
PHMSA.
Thank you very much. Just have 3 questions in 5 minutes. Hopefully we'll be short. To Ms. Doherty, I'd like to ask a question about integrity management. As you and the CPUC know and said, it's one of many different types of inspections. But I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about the regulatory approach and why. I mean, what's the value of that particular approach?
Integrity management is a performance-based regulation. It is not prescriptive. It is not a cookie-cutter regulation. It requires a understanding of pipeline facilities. It requires a comprehensive assessment of the facility. It also incorporates the ideas of risk management where you apply your greatest resources to your greatest risks. It provides additional protections where the greatest risks are to people and to the environment. As a performance-based regulation, it requires us to, well, let me back up. Performance-based regulations are very difficult. They are not easy, but sometimes the easy solutions are not the best solutions. It is a difficult regulation both to implement by operators and to inspect by regulators. But we believe it is worth the outcome, and we believe our safety trends are showing that it is effective.
Okay, thank you. For Mr. Barrett, I'd like to ask you just to talk a little bit about the development of the gas integrity management oversight process, your approach, how you prepared, and just describe quickly for us, if you will, what a gas integrity management audit might look like.
Okay, quickly. The integrity management program, once we had a rule out, we gathered our senior engineering staff and we partnered with our closest business partners, our state pipeline safety program partners, and we developed frequently asked questions, protocols to run through to develop out an implementation plan and program for integrity management. Integrity management inspections are certainly, as I think our operators would share with you, are not short-lived inspections. They're not a checklist. They're an investigative approach to looking at issues and threats and assessments of threats and methodologies that pipeline companies employ to address those threats. There'd be an inspection team that consists maybe 4 to 5 to 8 senior inspectors there that are running through a list of the protocols and looking at records and verifying records and looking at methodologies that are applied to the threats and preventive and mitigative measures and follow-ups. So they're not just a quick checklist approach. They're not just looking at procedures. They look at procedures. They look at the implementation of those procedures, and then They actually check the activities in the field on occasion when we have the opportunity, when there's a dig going or something like that, that we can verify what's done there. So the Integrity Management Program, again, was a joint effort between PHMSA and its state pipeline safety partners. We had several workshops. We also included the industry and review of the FAQs and any of our guidance material that we were pulling together, trying to address issues for the implementation of this rule. It's a very extensive integrity rule that we have. I think it's probably one of the most significant rulemakings that we have with PHMSA.
Great, thanks. And then lastly, a question for Mr. Metro. In terms of, I'm anticipating then your recommendation coming to us shortly, but would like to just ask if you would, we've had a long association between the states and PHMSA, the federal government. Wonder if you would talk just a little bit about how that plays out during the course of the year. Next year, you get to be the chairman, if you're not already, and maybe you could enlighten us on that.
Well, first, let me address your first point in that the process for NAPSR in proposing something to PHMSA works through the resolution process for all 48 states, and we only meet once a year, and we'll try to accelerate that process to get a resolution to PHMSA addressing the MEOP for grandfathered pipes. On the communication portion of it, as with all partnerships, there's been rocky periods in which there's been strained relationships. Over the last 5 years, both partners have worked very hard to develop a very good communication between each other and worked very hard to meet quite frequently. For example, we meet with PHMSA in all the regional meetings, which there are 5. We meet at the annual meeting. We have monthly calls with Jeff, with the executive board of NAPSR, and we meet in various ways with Zach and Linda and through different committees that we have. So I think the communication right now is at an all-time high, and the partnership is as strong as ever.
CPUC.
Thank you. A quick one for Mr. Metro. I'll let the microphone catch up. Quick one for Mr. Metro there. We've talked a couple of times and also just in the last exchange about prescriptive rules versus performance-based measures and regulation there. Can you flesh out what those two terms mean? And then I'll have a follow-up.
Well, performance-based measures are more measures that we look at, we study and analyze how the utility performs under certain thresholds. Prescriptive measures are more of a checklist of you must do this, 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 and this. Now, when we talk in terms of integrity management, they are performance-based. And from the NAPSR point of view, we believe that the performance-based measures are working. We need to study whether there's further enhancements are needed. But if you look at the number of anomalies that have been detected through performance-based measures, if you look at the number of repairs made to pipeline, there would be a very strong argument that performance-based measures are working. However, if you look at record keeping, that might be one area in which we need to get away from performance-based measures and look at prescriptive measures that you must keep this, 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 and this record.
Thank you. And same question for Ms. Daugherty. And I wonder whether you agree with that, and in particular, the notion of finding the right balance between prescriptive and performance-based in this area.
Yes, I agree. I believe that Paul stated it very well, that there is a balance. And we have found that performance-based regulations do have good outcomes if they are properly applied and the oversight is strong and effective. There are gaps that we're looking at. There are weaknesses, and we are addressing those. So yes, I thought it was very well said. I do believe that the record-keeping issue as identified in the advisory, yeah, that's something we need to look at.
Anything else other than record keeping that pops in your up to the top of your list on things where the balance might tilt towards prescriptive?
Mm-hmm. I would have to think about that.
And anyone else on the panel want to suggest anything else? How's the performance of the microphone doing that?
Perhaps prescriptive rules for microphones rather than performance-based would be better.
And of course, in the process, I think I've forgotten what I was going to add. Yeah.
We were talking about areas where you thought prescriptive might be better than performance-based.
One of the items, I'll jump in because I thought while she's recollecting her thoughts, one of the items that we do want to have.
We can't hear you, I'm sorry.
She did it. Okay. One of the items that we do believe we need to have more prescriptive requirements is on data reporting. You know, we collect a lot of data. Are we collecting the right data is a question. Can we use more? We need to know more about the infrastructure. I am sure that there will be people that'll say we collect plenty, that we collect too much and we aren't using what we have. I believe that that is probably not correct, that we do have data, we need to collect maybe different data. We need to have better understanding of our infrastructure. The infrastructure is changing, and in order to assess the risk, we need to understand it very well.
Thank you. The one thing I was going to add was that the rules, whether it is additional prescriptive rules or additional performance rules, is that I think they need to look more at making sure that there's continuous improvement included within the rule, and so there's not the opportunity to just sit with grandfathered pipes and not make an effort to either make them piggable or go and look at whether they need to be replaced. I think that that element of continuous improvement needs to be really strongly included in any performance-based rule, and if it needs to be included by adding a few other prescriptive rules, that's one way of doing it, or just make sure that it's strengthened in a performance-based rule.
And thank you, that's all I have.
Member Sumwalt.
Thank you, Ms. Daughtery. I know we're talking about integrity management systems in the global sense. Let me come in and focus on the San Bruno event. You mentioned before the break that if someone doesn't know what's in the ground, they need to find out what's in the ground, and certainly that sounds reasonable, and I think one of the things you mentioned was they dig it up and look at it. In the case of the San Bruno pipe, if they would have dug it up and looked at it, they wouldn't have seen anything abnormal, because as I understand it, it was we're looking at a internal seam well that was defective. And so in this case, your integrity management program is only as good as the data in which you populate it with, right?
That is correct.
So explain to me, bring it down to San Bruno and explain how, I mean, like I said, the integrity management program is only as good as the information in it. So how could a different integrity management system have made any difference in the outcome of this event?
It's a good question. It basically goes to how do you know what you don't know? I've heard that stated earlier, and it's a very good question. With the San Bruno situation, if they had known, and they excavated, perhaps they would have seen the multiple, we call them pubs, or they would have seen that the pipe was constructed somewhat in an unusual manner, and they may have done further research. To get to the internal seam, it's a very good question. I don't know how you would do it other than observing the external characteristics of the pipe that might cause you to say, look, this is unusual. Doesn't match what our records say, and we need to figure out what we've got here. So the question is valid.
And thank you. And so tomorrow we will be talking about industry-wide technology, which may be some of the answers. So thank you very much for your answer.
Member Weiner.
My background, of course, is not in pipelines, it's in aviation engineering. So if you pardon a naive question, and this is probably from Ms. Doherty, there's been several references to the notion of bringing a pipeline up to a certain high pressure at least once every 5 years. And what's the reason for that?
Under the federal regulations, there is no requirement for an operator to raise the pressure to MAOP to maintain that MAOP. My understanding, in short, is that PG&E may have raised the pressure in order to establish a MOP level such that if a new HCA was identified, they would not have to do a SEAM assessment.
So in a sense, then, this is a pressure test.
I would not consider it a pressure test. A pressure test under the federal regulations has very specific parameters. It requires that you bring the pipe to a certain level of stress and a certain duration.
So if this is not a pressure test, then it's kind of the aeronautical equivalent of seeing if I can get an old airplane up to max never exceed speed and see if it still stays together?
I would hope not. Like I said, the pipeline itself is not, or the operator is not required to pressure the pipe to the MAOP to maintain the MAOP. For example, I'll use an analogy. If the speed limit is 65, you can drive your car at 55, but you may go up to 65. You cannot exceed 65, but you may go up to it. You are not required to occasionally drive your car to 65 to show that it can go 65.
Okay, then the requirement is there just to avoid having to do another test in case you in case you have the environment around the pipeline change to a high consequence area? Is that did I understand that right?
My understanding is that the company chose to raise the pressure to establish the high MOP pressure at MAOP so that if a new HCA was identified, that it could use that pressure as the MAOP without doing a SEAM assessment. Let me see if I can help. The regulation says that when a new HCA is identified, you must look back 5 years to determine the highest MOP that line segment has seen. If you exceed that, if you've exceeded that, then you must do a SEAM assessment. The trigger date is the date of when you identify an HCA. So as I understand the materials presented, PG&E said we may have an HCA identified next year or 2 years down the road. Therefore, we want to establish our MOP. We want to bring it up so that to the MAOP level such that that is the benchmark.
Okay, thank you.
Member Roskine.
So we're going to go from the pipeline up to the country. We'll start on the Fed side, because I have one question I'd like to do from a federal perspective as well as state. One of the advantages of performance-based programs, of course, is that intrinsically you should be able to measure them. And so Mr. Barrett started by talking about sort of 100% and California PUC being at 90%. Is there a scorecard or report card based on audits or other evaluations of the state PUCs that you maintain to have a sense? Because I'm working toward, I hope, a sense of what is sort of the state of the country's PUCs.
Sure, we do a scoring document each year where we aggregate the score based on the information that they've sent us, their jurisdictions, their minimum training, and those sort of things. With the program evaluation, we use that score to distribute the grant funding each year. So yes, we do have scores for each individual state. You'll find that those scores are in the 90s to the high 90s.
So give us a sense of, and I heard what you just said, but is there an average, a standard deviation? Where are these state PUCs basically, and sort of how we're doing as a country?
As a country, I say that we're doing well. Your state pipeline safety programs are certainly meeting, the scores I think are primarily probably from 97 to 100, unless there's some problem with legislation like the PUC is experiencing where they don't have full safety authority like PHMSA would have over their operators, so we hit them pretty hard for that. But as the nation goes, our state pipeline safety programs are dedicated. The folks they take the same training their federal inspectors take at our Training and Qualifications Center in Oklahoma City at T&Q. They work with us, hand in glove. We try to support them in any questions or issues or investigations that they have underway.
So, I mean, based on that, do you have cutoffs for when somebody's not doing sort of up to?
We have. The only states that are not in the pipeline safety program are Alaska and Hawaii. Hawaii was in the pipeline safety program back in the 90s, 80s, in the early 90s. In 95, we decertified that state for failure to continue to do inspections. We worked with them. We tried to support their staff. It's kind of a last resort for us. We'd rather work with the state and help develop the state and improve the state's program's performance. But in the case where they're not doing inspections and we're not seeing safety enhanced or results we need, we can decertify a state.
So that's a great answer, because basically there's a cutoff where you're not certified anymore. So my concerns of great inflation, having everybody at 97%, is an accurate portrayal. So you have cutoffs, not that you have to decertify, but if there are areas that people aren't performing, the state PUCs, that's...
It's typically not based upon the scores. I mean, the scores would be indicative of that. They would go down if you failed to start, if you stopped doing inspections and stopped going to training and stopped doing the things, obviously you'd score very low. So we don't have an established score that's a cutoff, but we do look at the criteria in the form. We look at what our total program goals are, and if you're not meeting those, then we would decertify a state. It's only happened once in many, many years. Like I said, the program's been in since 1971. Our pipeline safety state programs perform well. As NTSB recognized earlier in the opening, that they accept their investigative reports when they're strapped for staff to do those sort of things. So I think that speaks well.
And so besides the overall score, there are flags for you, though, to basically intervene when needed to make sure they bring them up. On the other side, because there was an interesting, if not articulate, discussion about performance-based versus prescriptive. One of the challenges, of course, with prescriptive is the check-the-list sort of version of rules. And since I've been holding this from the last panel, we are hearing about public awareness, and there are 12 items of what's effective. And then we had an example here of, we sent out surveys and had 20 people of 15,000 respond. That's the kind of thing that could end up on a checklist that just says, oh, we did surveys. So, performance-based means have an effective evaluation of whether or not your program works, right? Not just that you send things out. Are those, again, performance-based, quantified in how you evaluate these programs?
Definitely. We would agree with you that public awareness is a performance-based regulation. You must be effective. That's the simple answer. There are many ways that you can be effective. You just have to figure out what those are for your designated audience. We heard earlier from the panel that they were using a survey technique that it doesn't appear was effective. We would have expected them to identify that as ineffective and to determine what would be more effective. There are many options.
And since we're out of time, and maybe on the whip around here I'll get the state part, but in that realm, waiting for them to say it wasn't effective, that's why I was asking about the scorecard, because, on one hand, it's on your list, demonstrate an effective awareness program. And I think this gets to some of the concern about the self-assessment part, which is, the way we heard it earlier, we were doing a good job with that survey, doing a bunch of things. When we look at it from another perspective, maybe it wasn't. So, their assessment may be different than you're taking a look at it and saying that doesn't meet our criteria of what effective should be.
That is part of our job as regulators, to look at what the company is achieving and to make a judgment on whether that in fact does meet the requirements of the regulation and whether it is having an impact. Unfortunately, as regulators, sometimes the performance measures and the metrics we use to measure effectiveness are long distance. They look down the road. So if you were to ask us today to measure the effectiveness of a rule that went into effect a short time before, it would be difficult to do.
And that, which again is, I'm sorry, but I think it's not, that's why I say it's not so much the rule part, but performance-based programs give you another avenue to quantify those and in a more short-term basis determine if they're meeting the objectives that you've set.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Yesterday, we asked PG&E if they were exchanging notes with other industries regarding safety management and risk management processes. I would have the same question for the regulators and overseers, and I would start with the PUC and ask, do you exchange notes with either other regulatory oversight agencies in California or with other utilities commissions in other states regarding what are effective means of oversight, what's not working so well, and those kinds of things, just because I know in these tight times you're looking for the most effective and efficient way to do it. Do you exchange notes with others in order to help do that?
Yes, absolutely. We're very active. Okay, now mine's not working. We're very active with NAPSR, National Association of Pipeline Specialist Safety Representatives. We talked with the State Fire Marshal. We're very active. We talk with all the different states. Our program manager, Mr. Rafi Stepanian, spends a lot of time talking with the other states about what they're experiencing and interfacing with PHMSA also.
And do you find that helps you do it better?
Absolutely, yes. Best practices.
Same question for PHMSA, except I'm only going to ask half the question because I know about the exchanging notes with other industries because I see Jeff Weiss at these multi-industry programs all the time, so I know you're doing that, but I would ask the same question about do you exchange notes with other federal regulators and overseers regarding most effective way and what's working, what's not working?
Yes, we do. As a matter of fact, we recently have met with some of our other counterparts. We met with EPA and Coast Guard to look at certain provisions of our regulations to see if we could benefit from each other, the knowledge. We've also looked at our enforcement programs. We've looked across at other federal agencies to determine how effective our programs are compared to other agency programs. We look across the Department of Transportation and see what other modes have used and how we can learn from them. I would also say that in some cases where we have cross-functional jurisdictional lines, for example, FERC inspects LNG facilities. We do as well. And so in those cases, I myself have participated on a joint inspection with FERC to learn from them and to see what they brought to the table that we could benefit and what we could share with them that they would benefit by.
So are you finding that exchange to be helpful?
It is useful. I do believe we could probably benefit from doing even more.
Thank you.
Can we go back to basics a little bit and how an operator establishes an MAOP and how that's approved?
Under 619, 192, 619 of our regulations, and you have to try to do this from memory, hopefully. There are 4 options under 619A that you can. You have to have the pipe materials and pipe specs. You have to have a pressure test. You have to have the 5-year window, and the 4th option is the most appropriate pressure based on the performance history that you have available. If you don't have all 4 of those things, it basically you have to opt down to 619C, which is the grandfather clause, which is the 5-year window from 1965 to 1970. That also invokes the class location factors that you have to consider in that. So that throws you back up to having to have design factors to know what your pipe is, or to address the earlier question, you can assume the most restrictive design factors on your pipe. So if you didn't know what the grade was of your pipe, you could assume 24,000 for the lowest grade that was available. And that's, the lowest of those is your maximum allowable operating pressure.
So does that indicate that this line for PG&E can't have a higher operating pressure than it did in the 60s? It has to be at least that low or lower based on the other factors that are considered here?
The maximum allowable operating pressure is locked in as it. That's as high as you can go with that, unless you go through an uprating to increase that maximum allowable operating pressure, and that usually involves the pressure test.
Okay, so their operating pressure is as it has been for some 40-plus years, and it can go no higher unless they do additional measures. But it can go lower if they identify weaknesses or defects, or the CPUC requires them to lower it for a regulatory reason.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's go back to this issue, because Member Weiner was probing it a little bit, and I just want to follow up because I think it's important. It seemed to me that CPUC and PHMSA both had kind of a different position than PG&E had on that 5-year test with the HCA identification issues. And I want to understand why. When they did this to establish what the MOP could be for newly identified HCAs, and we started looking at this, is this something that you had seen before, CPUC,
No, we had not seen it before.
PHMSA?
No, we had not seen that before. We had definitely not seen, it was the first time we had heard of operators doing this.
Okay. And Mr. Metro, maybe if I can ask you, because you have some awareness of potentially some other operators, is this something that other pipeline operators have done traditionally? Is PG&E, in the middle of the pack, or are they an anomaly here?
As far as NAPSR is concerned, it's an anomaly. We haven't seen other states report anything similar to this.
Okay. And if we can go back to hydro testing, and I know I don't have a lot of time here, but I just want to talk about the whole issue of doing hydrostatic testing from the regulator perspective. This is something that obviously was a requirement for new lines back in the early 1970s, so it's been around for a long time, but there are definitely pros and cons associated with hydrostatic testing, and we understand, particularly on a distribution system like PG&E. So can you just give us, from the regulator's perspective, some pros and cons? And I know we'll get a little bit more tomorrow with the panel tomorrow. Please, CPUC and then PHMSA.
Well, the pros, of course, are that you know beyond the typical operating pressure, the maximum allowable operating pressure of the pipeline, that it's not going to fail. The downside is the possibility of, and I'm not a metallurgist by any stretch of the imagination, but I have discussed it with some folks who are quite expert in this regard. There's a small possibility that you might create an anomaly in the pipe by raising the pressure as high as you do, and then bringing it back down. Of course, the other part, the other downside, is that the line has to be taken out of service, and that has consequences in terms of being able to deliver gas to people's homes and to hospitals and that sort of thing, where there's the other aspect of public safety. And then the final concern, as I understand it, is trying to get the water out of the pipe. There's a lot of time and effort spent to keep water from getting into pipes because it creates internal corrosion, and so you want to make sure that you get all of that out of there. Again, the people who actually operate these systems have much more expertise than I have, but I've talked to a number of people, and I think those are, in sum, the issues that we face.
And PHMSA, if you have anything different to add on that?
I would suggest that we have found hydrostatic testing to be of great value on the interstate long lines. When we have found defects, specifically seam defects, we have often ordered operators to conduct hydrostatic testing. As Richard mentioned, there are pros and cons. Depending on the type of anomaly that you have in your line, you may be able to remove defects, but at the same time, if you are not using a specific protocol in how you conduct the testing, you may grow defects till right before their failure stage, such that it can create issues. So hydrostatic testing has definite benefits, but it has definite cons, and you need to consider that. You do not want to eliminate one problem and create another one that you have a harder time detecting.
Okay, and from a regulatory perspective, is there any other alternative to hydrostatic testing to be able to provide confidence in a line?
Can we go first? There are various types of assessments you can do depending on the defect. They are successful to differing degrees. You'll hear tomorrow in the panel some of the challenges that we have, and I think they've come out in some of the discussion. Hydrostatic testing, pressure testing, is one of the old forms of destructive testing a pipe. You pressure it such that if there are any anomalies, they blow out, okay? And it's water coming out, so it's relatively safe. It's destructive. What that does not tell you is what is left in the line. So you may have removed all of the harmful anomalies, or you may have grown some harmful anomalies that if you had not pressure tested them may have been stable. So there's your balance. You ask for alternatives. Internal inspection tools, there are certain tools that will detect cracks and seams, but they can only be used under certain circumstances in certain lines. If you have lines with varying diameters, those tools may not function effectively. So you have to weigh the benefits of each type of assessment and figure out what your overall risk is and the overall benefit of the tool. And I would not, just maybe stretching a little bit, but I think people need to keep in mind, in addition to requalifying pipe through these types of tools, through repair or rehabilitation, there's always an alternative of replacement.
And maybe, unless you want to add something to that, CPUC, I think Ms. Halligan, you were really focused on this comment earlier, and I know your mic hasn't worked for you, but have we seen proactive action on any of these alternatives to hydrostatic testing in California?
Well, I think what we've found in PG&E's service territory, at least, is that we haven't seen an aggressive effort to make their pipes piggable, if you will, and we haven't seen a program to take the grandfathered pipe and either hydro test it or replace it. We haven't seen in the integrity management program thus far any aggressive efforts in those areas.
Okay, so there's definitely pros and cons to all of the tools that are at our disposal, but do you see cons with just leaving status quo and not doing any of the above?
Yes, clearly. I mean, the commission is at a point now where we've ordered PG&E to reduce pressure by 20% on several of its lines, and they're undergoing an MAOP validation effort that you've recommended that we've ordered them to do, and depending on what the results of that are, we'll be looking at taking additional actions, either requiring pressure testing or requiring a replacement program or perhaps other methods. But
okay, thank you very much. We actually are doing really good. We're ahead of schedule, so I'll turn back to the tech panel for a follow-up round of questions, and then we'll go through the parties in the Board of Inquiry.
I have a question for Ms. Doherty. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the need for prescriptive data. I think it was in response to Member Rosekind's question. And you mentioned data recording as an example of where more prescriptive standards might be necessary. My question to you is, when you're talking about the need for changing our approach to data collection, are you thinking specifically of data collected by the operator, or are you also addressing data collected by the regulator?
I think we're good. I would say that we need to look at both areas. We found through your investigation, through our own investigation of various accidents and incidents, that perhaps operators do not have access to the data that they should have. That's why we issued the advisory based on your recommendation. It is an important issue. If you found a risk assessment based on data, then you need to have the best data available. Now, having said that, you can't create data from the past. You can't create records of something that are gone. Yes?
I understand, but what I'm trying to get to is, you mentioned that as a regulator, you need to determine whether the operators are doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that what we've discussed has been looking at what the operators are collecting. And we found through earlier today with the mailing of the survey, for example, this did not appear to be a very productive effort based on the number of responses received. It seems to me that the regulator can also collect data
I
that
would
would
agree with you.
indicate whether the operators are doing an effective job.
There are two
Or-
aspects to that. There is the aspect that the operator collects data that we review during an inspection for very specific programs, perhaps a public awareness program. The other aspect is PHMSA and our state partners need to have data in order to accurately assess the risks on the national infrastructure and look at trends.
Can you give me an example of such
Yes.
data?
Actually, there was one that was brought up. I was asked the question if we had specific data on the number of miles that had been hydrostatically pressure tested. And I said I did not know. I've later been told that we don't have that information. So that is a piece of information that might be useful. It might help us better assess the nation's infrastructure.
Thank you.
I have a question both for CPUC and Ms. Doherty from PHMSA. And this refers to Mr. Salas' statement yesterday regarding RCVs and ASV. And one comment was regarding the technical hurdles using these valves. Does CPUC or PHMSA have any comments on them? Have you used any other operators use those successfully or unsuccessfully?
I would like to comment on that. I would mention that we have recently issued an ANPRM on our liquid side and will likely be issuing an ANPRM on the gas side that asks that very question. Should ASVs or RCVs have broader use, and should the government require the installation of those, and where should those be installed? Our integrity management rules led the way with rulemaking that said operators should consider those valves and the placement of those to protect HCAs. Now we are coming back to the broader stakeholder audience and saying we need to revisit this and determine if we need to require those in a larger setting. So yes, we believe those are very important.
And at the PUC, this is very much as I indicated in my answer to the city. This is very much a high priority item for us in our rulemaking to consider whether or not we should require the installations of automatic shutoff valves or remotely controlled valves. As a matter of fact, one of the first issues that we addressed in this regard was to order PG&E to undertake a study of where they might place automatic or remotely controlled valves. And we did that very early on, soon after the pipeline failure in San Bruno.
I guess we are running out of time. We are okay? Good. Does PHMSA or CPUC see any technical problems with these valves that makes their use questionable?
That's an unknown for us at this point. That's why we're putting it through a rulemaking to examine it thoroughly.
Thank you. Pass on to Mr. Nicholson at this time.
I would like to follow up on the same subject, really, and get Mr. Metro's input maybe on ASVs and RCV use. Are other states exceeding the federal code right now in mandating the use of these valves?
I don't have a data on that. I can't tell you off the top of my head. I know just looking at the issue from the 30,000-foot level is that the valves, while they are a very good idea and are needed, there's appropriate places to install these valves in appropriate conditions. And we need a feasibility study done to determine those thresholds, where the proper places are and what the appropriate places are for these valves to be installed.
And Ms. Dougherty, I think you answered my question. The last report I saw was 1999 from DOT on ASVs, RCVs. Is there something more recent, or is it you're just going straight into the rulemaking?
To my recollection, there is not anything more recent other than internal reviews and discussion, and perhaps discussion with some of our stakeholders. I don't think there's a formal report. I would say that when we go into the ANPRM process, we do trigger the full rulemaking process, which is, as those of you that have dealt with it know, it's quite a system. You have to go through, you propose the idea. Sometimes the best solutions do not make it through simply because of the cost benefit. We can look at, ideally, it would be wonderful if we could replace all older pipe and we could put valves at very, very frequent intervals. The fact of the matter is there's a cost to that, and whether the American economy can bear it or not, I don't know. That's an issue that will be discussed. When you go through the rulemaking process, we are required to do a cost benefit. That's part of the rulemaking process. So we don't know where that'll end up.
And actually, a cost benefit was done, I think, in the 1999 report. Is that correct? Okay.
I believe so. I have seen estimates that replacing 50% of valves would be very much in the millions, like 600 million. It would be very, very costly. So it's something that we have to consider.
To Mr. Lee, I would ask also, if was part of your audit in either 2005 or 2010 a review of the policy memo regarding ASVs and RCVs within PG&E?
Yes, I believe we looked at it.
And was there a finding or penalty?
No, there wasn't.
No, there wasn't. Okay. All right, that's all I have. Anything else?
Madam Chairman, the technical panel has no more questions for the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Shatra. Do we have parties who have questions? City of San Bruno.
Just a quick follow-up on the discussion you were just having regarding replacement of valves, and clearly understanding and recognizing the enormous potential cost. Have either of your agencies considered the potential value of rules that might consider system replacement, pipeline replacement, as part of a best practice and/or a regulation?
Thank you. Certainly, we're looking at that, absolutely. I mean, that's part of bringing the rate making into more closely aligning the rate making with the safety work that's going on, the maintenance and that sort of thing, is to take a look at pipeline replacement in particular situations and encourage it when we feel it is necessary.
On the federal side, the regulations do not require full-scale replacement of pipelines. However, I will say that we are considering how some of these infrastructure issues can be addressed in the long term. I would also mention that we have suggested to certain pipeline operators that segments of line that have shown to have been problematical be replaced, and some of those lines are being replaced. So it may not always require a rulemaking solution to obtain good results for the public.
Thank you.
Any other parties requesting another round? FEMSA?
Sorry about that. If you allow me, I'd
No
like to...
need to apologize, Mr. Weiss.
Always have questions. I'd like to follow the line of questioning that the city began there, because I think we're very much interested. Clearly, as safety regulators, the CPUC and PHMSA would like nothing more, and the rest of our state partners, than to have brand-new pipeline systems out there. So just interested more in exploring some of the impediments, and I know the states have been thinking about this a lot, but they have different impediments at a federal level. You know, it goes to how does a company recover those costs. So I didn't know if Mr. Metro wanted to comment on any kind of innovative approaches he may have seen in different states, or work that may be going on at the state level on that.
Many states have pipeline replacement programs. Now, when you talk about putting in valves, there's a limited source of dollars that the states have, so if they have a lot of cast iron and unprotected bare steel to remove, it's going to be one or the other. It's going to be very difficult to balance the two. And from a risk assessment strategy, I would look at replacing the bare steel and the cast iron first.
Great, thank you. And then lastly, for Ms. Doherty, first of all, I appreciate Vice Chairman Hart's comments. He and member Sumwalt and I have been in a number of interagency committees together, which I always find very fascinating, and NTSB has led the way on a lot of the safety culture initiatives, so appreciate that. But are there any other forums, Ms. Doherty, you might want to comment on?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to correct my oversight. One of the areas that we're reaching out to is international. There are a lot of countries that have pipeline infrastructure. Some of it's older than ours, and so we are reaching out to them. We also hope to have an international forum this summer to pull some of our counterparts from around the world to sit down and talk about how we address some of these infrastructure issues. Thank you.
Thank you. No additional questions from the parties. Member Weiner.
Yeah, I'd like to address this to CPUC. We've talked a lot about the regulations and the operations at the PHMSA level, so I'd like to understand how that flows down to the state level. What regulations, or what are the state's regulations relative to PHMSA's regulations in terms of at the state level? In other words, do you just flow down a copy of them? Do you write your own regulations? What's the relationship?
Well, in our General Order 112, which was first adopted in 1961, I believe, we set the standards at our level for pressure testing in a number of other areas. When the Department of Transportation first wrote rules with regard to pipeline safety, we changed our general orders so that it incorporated those rules and any modifications and updates to those rules. We have the authority at the state level to expand upon those rules, and that's what we're doing. We've done it in the past in terms of some record-keeping issues. We're doing it now much more. We're taking a look at how we can broaden and deepen that effort.
Does PHMSA in any way then certify the state, or are you completely independent?
They review our programs, and I've forgotten whether we actually have a certification in this program or not. We do, right? Right. Sorry, I have so many programs. It's sometimes hard to recall.
Yeah.
But we do have a certification, yes.
Is this an annual certification?
Yes.
Okay. Now then, CPUC has an inspector cadre, I presume.
Yes.
Are these full-time inspectors?
Yes.
They don't do anything else other than pipelines?
That's the current situation, yes. We used to have our entire utility safety and utility branch do electric safety, communication safety, and gas safety. But about a year prior to, I think, San Bruno, we decided that we needed to have people specialize in pipeline safety, and the other side does electric safety and communication safety.
Okay. So these folks then conduct audits and inspections
Yes, and investigations of
and
accidents.
investigations. The audits and inspections, are they a paperwork exercise, or are they really go out and kick the tires?
They're both. They're primarily paperwork exercises, however, but we, a number of years ago, across all of our safety programs, said that we need to test what we find. We need to go out and look over the shoulder of the person who's doing the inspection for the utility or the maintenance work for the utility. And if they're an inspector, we need to, one, make sure that they're finding what they're supposed to find. Secondly, that they're doing what they're supposed to do with what it is that they're finding. So we don't simply rely upon the records that we see. We go out and we verify that that which we see in the records is that which is happening on the ground.
Okay, and then what sort of enforcement capabilities do you have when you see something that you didn't want to see?
We have the ability to open an order instituting investigation. Well, I should back up a little bit. We have a progressive enforcement scheme that we use, or a staged enforcement scheme that we use, which begins with telling the operator, and this applies to the electric side as well as the gas side. All of our programs have an escalated enforcement program where we tell them to fix it within a particular time frame, give us a corrective action plan, and adhere to that corrective action plan. If we see that either that they're not responding in a timely manner and taking care of their responsibilities, or we're seeing a pattern of egregious behavior, then we have the ability to take an enforcement action against them through an order instituting investigation at the commission. We're exploring now the Pennsylvania model and the Oregon model, where they have statutory authority to impose just upon natural gas pipeline operators specific penalties. It's an issue for us of delegation from the commission to be able to issue a citation.
All right, thank you for clarifying that.
You're very welcome.
Member Rosekind.
So I thank PHMSA for taking us through your auditing evaluation, and it's nice to hear the state of the industry is at 97%. So just to keep this balanced, California PUC, you do these audits. Is there a scorecard, report card? How do they get sort of collated up into some overall look at how an organization is doing? And then can you benchmark that against others in California?
Well, in reality, we only have 2 operators in California. So it's Pacific Gas and Electric, and then it's the Sempra utilities, which are 2, Southern California Gas and San Diego Gas and Electric. So it's more of a qualitative assessment than it is a quantitative assessment of how each one of the utilities are performing. And then in terms of looking out at what the other utilities across the nation are doing, that's an area of improvement for us that PHMSA has requested that we undertake. And there was an opportunity for improvement that they pointed out to us in their last audit, and they've agreed to work with us in terms of defining what those criterion are by which we can judge the performance.
So you'll be able to take those audits and put them up into a report. Again, benchmark within the state, pretty small. But being able even to look at trends in a company over time, or to set thresholds of where some kind of intervention or enforcement is required, it helps you to quantify those and then gives you a sense across the country. But right now, that's not really the approach. It's more qualitative.
That's with respect to the integrity management program. Now, as I talked about with the other member, we have General Order 112, where we do inspections of many, many aspects of the utilities operation. And we capture that data in our databases, and we do use that to help target our inspective activities, because before we go out and do a GO 112 audit, we look at what the problems were that we had in the past. We look at any sorts of trends that are developing, and then we go out and we do our audit. And again, in our audit, we look at the paperwork, and then we test that on the ground as much as we can.
So you may have example approaches and models that you're using in other areas that you can transfer over here and quantify that a little bit more?
Yes,
in some
absolutely.
way. The last question, and I was curious about this, and the chairman helped sort of clarify it for me, actually. I was wondering what happens when there's sort of a difference between a federal and state perspective on an issue. And what the chairman helped clarified was, PG&E came with something that nobody had really, what we're hearing is, nobody done before. How does that get addressed and resolved?
Well, it's first resolved via good communications with our friends at PHMSA. And we talk about it, and then if we decide that we want to take a different approach at the state level, as long as it doesn't interfere with interstate commerce, we're free to do so.
I would agree. When the state always has the prerogative of implementing regulations that are more stringent than the federal regulations. In fact, that's a great thing. They know the circumstances. So many states adopt the federal regulations directly. Some have more robust and more stringent regulations, which they are entitled to do.
Great. Thank you.
That's great, because that's exactly the direction I wanted to go in. States can have more stringent regulations than the federal regulations, but can they have less stringent regulations than the federal regulations?
No.
Okay, so they must at least meet or incorporate those regulations.
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Metro, how many states actually go beyond the federal regulations in certain areas?
I don't have that information. That might be something that PHMSA collects in their certification process.
Okay. PHMSA, any ideas?
We actually do not collect that information, how many states have more stringent, but there has been some surveys that we conducted with the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives, where I think quite a few or a majority of states have some regulations, usually in the reporting area, that's more restrictive than what PHMSA is.
Okay, and so for a lot of people watching this, this is an intra-state pipeline, and the feds don't really have any jurisdiction here, is that right?
Well, that's not completely true.
Okay.
We certify the states for the safety authority over the intrastate pipeline system. We support their program with grant funding. We evaluate the program. We support them in their inspections. But I think PHMSA could, for a given incident, for a given isolated thing, that we could take additional action if deemed necessary. At the current stage, we're working with California PUC. We're working well together. We're going to do some joint work in looking at the risk assessment documents with PG&E. We're going in together. We're not leading that. We're going in as partners in that. It's a partnership. That is what I would leave you with.
Okay, but you all have limited resources. Mr. Clark, you had a conversation with the technical panel, and we have FTEs, full-time equivalents. You have PYs,
right.
Person years, and so you have less than 20 PYs that work on pipeline safety.
That's correct.
How many FTEs do you have on the federal side with respect to safety inspectors and investigators?
We're currently authorized a little over 200. I think the number's like 206. With turnover, we're probably just at 200 as far as the entire organization. Roughly half of that or a little over half of that, like 126, are inspectors. Now, that is spread throughout our 5 region offices and the inspectors, that is, 5 region offices and district offices. I would point out that according to our statistics, the state programs regulate roughly 80% of the pipeline mileage simply because of the intrastate facilities. And they roughly augment the federal workforce of 200 people by an additional 300.
Okay, so we have about 500 assets nationwide to do oversight of pipelines and pipeline safety activities. And so how much of CPUC's program is supported by federal dollars? Mr. Barrett?
For the calendar year 2009 activities, approximately 63% of the total program cost for the program that year was federal dollars. We project, we're in the middle of looking at the It's a reimbursable grant. The state's calendar year 2010 activities have currently taken place. They're now they're sending to us their end-of-year program cost. We're reviewing those costs, and then we'll refunding them. I estimate the California PUC's estimated program cost reimbursement for calendar year 2010 would be about 63%.
Okay, so there's kind of a symbiotic relationship here between the states and the feds. We provide, the federal government provides resources for the states to conduct their programs. The states are providing data to the federal government for their data collection, record keeping, risk assessment type programs. But when we look at what kind of the scope of the regulatory activity is over the years, when you all went to performance-based regulations, you didn't take away any of the prescriptive regulations. You built on what was there before, what you had been doing in the past. This was another layer on that, correct? What do you all think are the biggest challenges for safety regulators when it comes to oversight of performance-based programs? Where do you all fall down?
I will speak very directly on that. Performance regulations are not easy to oversee. They're very difficult. They require a judgment call. For decades, our inspectors, mostly engineers, very technically oriented people, were able to go out and evaluate a prescriptive regulation by determining if the operator had checked the number of valves they were supposed to in the time frame. Now they are required to think in a totally different manner. They have to evaluate the adequacy of an operator's technical justification. It is difficult. It's a difficult way of evaluating a program, but it's effective. And we believe it's effective, and we believe the results are showing out. We have had challenges in convincing our own workforce that it's the right way to go. We have right now both prescriptive inspections and the performance-based, the integrity management inspections. And as our regulations develop, we will continue to maintain that simply because, as you pointed out, we have a baseline of prescriptive regulations, and then we added on the performance on top of that. So we will always need people that can focus on prescriptive compliance and also performance-based. I hope I answered your question.
Well, maybe what I can do is share with you a couple of accidents that we've investigated and areas in performance-based oversight where we've seen that there are problems. Maybe you can help me understand how you address these. We've looked at accidents in which there's a segment of pipeline that should have been identified as an HCA, but it wasn't by the operator. And so this is kind of, to me, a little bit similar with the situation that we have with the records here. You're relying on the operator to provide you information, and you at some point have to accept that information is valid. This goes back to Mr. Clark with the trust but verify. You know, take the information that they give you, but go out and make sure that what they're telling you is the right thing. It's very difficult, I think, on first instance or review for you all to identify that. You know, whether it's that their underlying documentation isn't there to support the description of the pipe for this segment, or whether an area should be in HCA or not. If we get into even more detail, we look at the Kingman accident. And in that accident, you all identified in their integrity management program some things that were not included that should have been. You inspected their program for their anhydrous ammonia pipe, and the inspection revealed that they didn't have a number of things with respect to their baseline assessments. And the risk factors required by regulations that were not addressed by Enterprise, who was the operator, noted the following risk factors were not addressed: seam type, results of previous assessments, defect type, and size that the assessment method can detect, and defect growth rate. Those were not present. So you identified, you gave us this plan, and all of these required pieces of it were missing. Okay, so that was great. Somebody actually looked at it, they gave them feedback, but they missed one thing. They missed leak history, and that wasn't part of their plan. And so then when we come back, and we have 20/20 hindsight, we're coming in after the fact, something's already happened, we have plenty of time to take a look at it, but we identify that here we missed another one. And so with performance-based, it's almost incumbent upon you all to have to find the needle in the haystack, where you've been tripped, where you can't find something. And the operator has a lot of ability to put forward information, and you all might not have the resource. 500 people for the whole country. That's not very many. That's 10 people per state. How
Yes.
can you look at all of those plans, and how can you look over everyone's shoulders, and how can you verify that everything that they give you, you go and check that that's right?
You raise very good points, and we are definitely well aware that it is a challenge to get out to those facilities and find problems. I would go back and mention that it is not the regulator's responsibility to assure that operators comply. It is the operator's responsibility to assure that they comply. We know that when we go out and do inspections, we're going to do the most thorough job we can, and we're going to look at every issue. But we are limited on resources, and we can only spend 4 or 6 weeks on an integrity management review. We may take a team of people, and we may scour through records, but there's some familiarity we will not have, because we look at, dozens, hundreds of company plans. We will not know them as detailed and in-depth as the company personnel, but we do bring a couple of things. We learn from national review, or in the case of the state's review of plans. We learn for triggers and flags, and we're trained to find those areas. We don't catch them all. I wish we would. We do miss some. But I think the important point is that we have to train our personnel to look for those flags. We have to work side by side with our states and share that information of how to look for. Now, you mentioned performance regulations, and I would point to a recent study done on Deepwater Horizon. And that study looked at what could have been done a little bit better. And I believe that the results of that study said, look, performance-based regulations are a way we may want to go. They validated the approach that we are taking. I sound repetitive, and I apologize, but it's not easy. It's hard, but it's worth the effort. If we can get the job done right, then we'll be focusing our resources on the risks, we'll be addressing threats to the infrastructure, and therefore making the public safer.
Right, and I see Mr. Clark wants to comment, but can I ask you both to comment on the sanctions when you actually identify through performance-based plans, when you identify deficiencies or defects? What tools do you have to get to a point where you incentivize the operator to not have those defects so that you don't have to take the comb through and find them? Is it the cost of doing business, or is there a real disincentive for them to have an error in their plan?
I'll speak to that first, and simply because my mic is on. On the federal side, we have a variety of enforcement mechanisms. When we find that an operator has not complied with our rule, We can issue a warning to them, depending on the degree. We can issue a notice of amendment, or we can issue a civil penalty. Those civil penalties can be quite large. And depending on the severity of the violation, we will use those. And we have shown that we will do those. We're in the multi-millions of civil penalties. That is not the preferable way. The preferable way is for a industry to stay in compliance. But we will take action if we find an operator is endangering the public by not complying with the rules. Now, I would suggest also that in the administration's proposal, we have looked at raising our civil penalty limits such that we can have an even stronger bite if somebody does something wrong. Now, I will also mention something else. You referred to whether an operator's incentive is to comply or not to comply. That isn't a choice. And if we ever find an operator that is deliberately or intentionally not complying with the regulations, we will turn them over to the Inspector General or Department of Justice for criminal enforcement.
One of the benefits of participating in an NTSB hearing is the quality of the questions that are asked of us, I must say. Being a regulator, it's difficult to stand on the outside and look inside what's going on in an operation. So my first direction to my people is that I don't want them to be on the outside looking in, I want them to be on the inside looking around. But even being on the inside looking around, you can't know everything that the operator knows. And if there is an expectation that we achieve that, then that's an unrealistic expectation. As far as performance-based regulation, it's not only difficult to judge whether performance has been achieved in the manner that you want it to be achieved, but it's also very difficult to enforce performance-based regulations, because the case that you have to bring to bear becomes quite complex. It's nuanced in terms of whether or not there has been a violation of one order or another, and whether that order of magnitude of that violation requires a penalty to be assessed. It does not mean that it cannot be done by any stretch of the imagination. It's just easier when you have a linear violation of a prescriptive statute. So what we do in terms of attempting to address these sorts of issues is that we take a systems approach to safety, just as PHMSA does. And we look at, so here's the vision for my organization and our organization, I should say, not my organization, and the culture that we try to develop within our organization. And that is, first of all, we have to be experts in our field. We have to know the rules, we have to know the laws, we have to know as much as we can about those that we are regulating and what their incentives are, where it is they're trying to go, all the different elements of a system that you have to understand in order to know where an organization is headed and how they're trying to get there. The second thing is we have to be objective. We can't bring emotion and personal perspective. We have to be critical in our thinking. When we see something, we have to go beyond, if it's written down on the piece of paper, whether or not we then look and verify, trust but verify, as you aptly said. And then we have to continuously improve the system. And that means improving the rules, and it also means taking enforcement action when the time has come that you take enforcement action. And so part of my role is essentially to act as a district attorney in terms of trying to figure out when it is that it's time to bring an enforcement action. And you know, you make mistakes in that regard sometimes, but for the most part, when we get to the point where we're not getting compliance with the corrective action plans that have been given to us by the utilities, and we have said, okay, this is a fine corrective action plan, and we're not getting it, or we feel that the utilities are misrepresenting the facts, then we will absolutely take enforcement actions in that regard. It's important to have a just safety culture also, which is important in terms of being a regulator, a just regulator. One of the problems with the enforcement of prescriptive regulations is that many times it becomes a gotcha game. We don't want to have a gotcha conversation when it comes to the safety of the natural gas system in the state of California. We want to have a conversation about where are you going, how do you plan to get there, do we agree with where you're going and how you plan to get there, and are you making good progress in that regard? The Commission, I believe, is moving in a direction of taking a broader and deeper look at that regulatory scheme and the balance between prescriptive regulation and performance-based regulation and rate making, which gives us just another insight into, or actually a deep insight into, what's going on the inside. Because when you start looking at the money and where it's going and what the priorities are, then you're there.
Did anybody else want to add anything? Mr. Metro?
Yes, your assessment is accurate about the 500 inspectors across the nation. For every new state inspector, we would add 100 inspection days, which is a tremendous statistic that that would add additional safety measures for the states. Congress has authorized the states to receive up to 80% funding, but they've never appropriated that amount. We've been looking at around 60% appropriation. Could be less, could be more. We don't know this coming year. The other point that you brought up is training. Training, we only have one training facility in the United States. It's in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and that's for all 500 engineers, inspectors. We need more training facilities across the nation and more trainers.
Thank you all very much. This has been a great panel. We've got a lot of good information to think about as we go forward with our analysis and our report preparation. We very much appreciate your service and your frank and candid answers to our questions. I understand we do have one witness that the tech panel would like to recall from yesterday. Ms. Ward will excuse this fourth panel and recall a witness.
Yes, Madam Chairman, we'd like to recall Mr. Bob Fassett.
Ms. Ward, he was already sworn yesterday, so you don't need to do it again, correct? Okay. Mr. Budinsky, did you have some questions for Mr. Fassett?
Yes, I have a short series of questions. Good afternoon, Mr. Fassett. Wanted to revisit our integrity management discussion from yesterday's session 2.
Mr. Budinsky, can you pull the microphone a little closer?
Wanted to revisit our integrity management discussion from yesterday's session 2. Just looking for a little more clarity, and also I think it might set the stage for session 5 tomorrow. I'd like to know a little bit more about if you could indicate the specific threats identified for line 132, section 180, as you knew them before the accident.
I don't recall specifically. I believe, though, Ms. Peralta mentioned that in the morning, and I referenced it in a response to Mr. Weiss yesterday afternoon. But there was an interacting threats between corrosion and outside force associated with the fact that it's crossing, that it's in a seismic area and it's an older line.
So mainly that's two threats, really, that you were inspecting for. That's correct?
That's correct.
And how did you arrive at this list? What was the criteria that you used to establish those threats?
It's through, it's through our risk assessment procedures established in RMP 6 that we discussed yesterday.
Yeah, okay. And how were they inspected specifically?
Through, you mean in the actual inspection
Yeah.
associated with the line?
Yeah, for those particular threats. how did
External
you-
corrosion direct assessment was used to evaluate the corrosion aspect of it, and we monitored to determine if there was any outside force, any land movement. I believe we have records. I don't recall if they were provided as an exhibit through a DR or not, but we have records to show that there was no outside force on that pipe.
Okay. Thank you. That's all for my questions.
Just to make sure everyone else has an opportunity, did anybody else want to follow up? Seeing no requests, any of the members of the Board of Inquiry? No. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fassett, for being available to come back. And this
Appreciate it.
concludes our deliberations for the day, and we will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to consider the testimony from the final panel. We're adjourned.